I'm Dan White. Our guest is T.C. Boyle. He's the author of 23 books of fiction and a brand new novel, San Miguel, which is coming out in September. He's also putting the finishing touches on a new collection of short stories. Welcome, T.C. Boyle.
Yeah, I've been busy, very busy.
You sound like you've been extremely busy.
Finishing up the second volume of the collected stories for publication in the following fall of 2013.
I would love to talk to you about that, about the new works, about the collection and the new novel. I'd like to start off by going deep into your past as a writer who's engaged with the natural world. It's one thing to be worried about the environment. It's another thing to engage with this subject in an artistic way. What is it about this topic, man in relation to the natural world, that keeps bringing you back to it and speaking to you as an artist?
Everybody finds his own theme and obsession, if he's lucky, that is. And this is mine. I might have been a biologist if it weren't for the dreaded math component of it. I am simply fascinated by the natural world as an explorer in it, as an animal in it, as one who spends a lot of time alone in deep and remote nature. It's very important to me, and I guess if we look back from my very first writings in my first collection, Descent of Man, I was already working with some of these themes.
Now, with Descent of Man and with the Extinction Tales, which we're proud to feature in the debut issue of Catamaran, I'm wondering, was there a starting gun for you that got you all fired up about this topic when you were young?
I guess I probably blundered into it. The Extinction Tales I wrote while I was a student at Iowa in the Writers' Workshop there. And, of course, the stories are very various in that collection, but, you know, they are under the rubric of the title story, Descent of Man, which stems from my reading of Darwin and my disillusion with the fact that people have always maintained that we are not animals, that we can separate the intellectual part of our being from the animal part. And it's not true. And the case in Descent of Man was that I had learned that the first experiments were going on with chimpanzees using language in the laboratory, and I wrote a story to wonder about that. By the same token, at around that time, I began to become aware of extinctions of various creatures, these magical creatures like the dodo, for instance. Where have they gone to? And why are they gone? What does it mean? And so I put together a sort of conglomerate story about various extinctions, which of course comes down to the fact that not only will our parents be extinct, so will we ourselves and our lineage too at some point.
I was hoping you could comment on that unusual setup and structure for the Extinction Tales. The story has a lot in common thematically with many of your best-known stories that deal with the natural world, but that structure, as you mentioned, is quite different. It almost felt like a short story collection in its own right, several micro-fictions that are linked together with the extinction theme. Now, how did you choose that structure?
Early on, especially, I played around with fragmenting structure of stories. My hero in those days, and remains one of my heroes, is Robert Coover. I was just beginning to write stories prior to going to Iowa when I was still living in New York, and I had the idea that I wanted to play with the discrete elements of a fiction and to mix and match them so that one element would play off another without necessarily having the kind of linkage you would see in a more conventional story. Coover's Prick Songs and Descants just blew me away when I first saw that, because he was doing the same thing and perfectly well. So from the beginning, I've always liked to play with the structure of a story, and I still do. Maybe my narratives are more connected now for the most part, but if you look through the stories in the collected stories, the second volume, which is from '98 until present, you'll see that there are several that also work in this way.
Now, your stories about people in relation to the natural world are always troubling to me because you humanize these characters always, even when they're doing such incredibly dumb, destructive things. Extinction Tales is one of the earliest examples. We've got these two brothers in the late 19th century, Seth and Jared, and they're young and ambitious, and they want to make a living. And they have no way of knowing that the passenger pigeon's not a limitless resource. You describe the sky choked with birds, the masts blotting out the sun, and suddenly there's just one left. And I found that just shocking. I was wondering if that's what you're setting out to do, to shock readers out of their complacency when that came out.
Well, by God, you talk of intention, but my intention is just to explore something. And if it's shocking to see what we've done to the natural world, well, all the better. I'm not running for office. I'm not campaigning for anything. I'm simply exploring the world in my own way. And what obsesses me, as we said earlier, is our relationship to nature and our animal being on this planet. And I think if you could draw a line through all of my books and find this theme to one degree or another in all of them. You know, as hunter-gatherers and then finally as farmers and city dwellers, we did rely at one time on nature to provide us with food as far as the terrestrial life is concerned, but all those animals were wiped out. Now we are seeing that the oceans too are depleted. There are no limitless resources, and I guess when I think back to my early days in writing the Extinction Tales, I was aware of this and trying to assess what it means.
Your fiction suggests an unsentimental view of the natural world. In other words, very much worth preserving, but not a peaceable kingdom either. I'm thinking specifically of that famous scene in Big Game. I should mention just quickly for people who are not familiar with the story, the short story that takes place in this sleazy game preserve outside of Bakersfield, California, where rich Los Angelinos can drive out there and bag these African mammals for bragging rights. But that last scene when suddenly we're in the point of view of Bessie B's head and she's going to kill these people, and it's just a kind of a scary moment. So I'm wondering about this unsentimental view of the natural world that comes across in some of these stories. Not a John Muir perspective, in other words.
No, not at all. And I'm glad that you adduced that story. It's one of my proudest moments when we enter Bessie B's head and see humans for what they really are. I enjoyed that, and I've come back to scenes like that in other stories. For instance, in A Friend of the Earth, which is about global warming and projects 25 years into the future. It was published in the millennial year of 2000. In that, we have a certain rock and roll star who has an estate in the Santinas Valley with various animals which he has purchased and keeps as tokens of the wild. And I wonder what the ethics of that are. So too, in my most recent novel, When the Killing's Done, which is about the fight over restoration on the Channel Islands, we have two environmentalists going head-to-head because in some sense it becomes a kind of turf war. Yes, they want to preserve the indigenous species which are threatened with extinction, but on the other hand, each wants to do it in his or her own way. The novel now is just, it's in the thinking phases.
So, is that going to take us back to the Channel Islands again, may I ask?
No. It was unusual that the two last books were set on the Channel Islands. But when I was doing research for When the Killing's Done, which is my most overtly environmental book, aside maybe from A Friend of the Earth, I came across a wonderful historical story about San Miguel Island, the most remote, farthest one out, and the most damaged ecologically by sheep grazing. And it's a story of two families that lived there in different periods, but had these amazing correspondences. And of course, the ecologic theme remains, although this is mainly a drama, and it is, that we all want to have our own place, our own island, our own kingdom, our own place away from everyone else, and live in harmony with it. But I wonder if that is possible. And so I did write a second novel set on the Channel Islands. The one I'm contemplating now will very likely be set in Northern California.
And is there anything else you can tell me about the new one? The one that's kind of taking shape?
I'm in the beginning phases of it. But it's good because at least I have some ideas of what's to come. Because if you don't have ideas, then you have to refer to the loaded gun sitting next to the desk.
And going back to the whole wild theme, quite a few stories that you've written in the books talk about our impact in the natural world, unintentional and otherwise. And I was hoping you could talk about the ways that nature influences human behavior in some of your work, the way that you see nature casting this kind of almost a spell on human characters to varying degrees. I'm thinking of poor Junior in Tooth and Claw, who adopts that absolutely vicious African hunting cat. And by the end, I feel like he's kind of dispensed with some of his machismo and his projections of his macho fantasies, and he's kind of seeing the cat kind of for what it really is, and he's a bit closer to the cat. And then another more fully involved example would be Victor, the wild child, who's just completely feral, just this beast of the woods. No one can turn him back to civilization. If you could talk a bit about that part of your imagination that's drawn to that sort of a hybrid, that part human, part beast of the forest kind of creation, or the natural influence on these human characters.
I like your examples very much, and I'm very pleased that you've read so deeply in the work and see these connections. It's wonderful to hear. Again, I could reduce the Kinsey book, The Inner Circle, where Kinsey, the scientist, said, the poets have had 2,500 years to tell us about love. Now I will tell you about the sexual function in the human animal. He was trying to separate our intellect from our animal nature. This fascinates me. The examples you give here, Victor of Aveyron, the wild child, l'enfant sauvage. I wrote his story at length in a novella, which is the title piece of the Wild Child collection. What makes us human? And again, we go back to what we were talking about with regard to my first book, Descent of Man. The use of language makes us human. Victor was unable to attain language because, as Noam Chomsky has theorized, we have a period in our growth, let's say 2 to 5 years old, in which we are programmed genetically, biologically, to acquire language. We become acculturated. We learn language. If that period is passed for whatever reason, it may be impossible to acquire language, and that was the case with Victor. So I'm really talking about what it means to be human and to communicate in a human way.
And speaking of natural influence and human behavior, now you've been examining this issue for quite a long time now in your fiction, and I'm just wondering, what is it about the American character in particular that makes us behave in such extreme ways towards the natural world, whether we're trying to protect it or to spoil it? Just, is there something intrinsic to our character that makes us behave differently than other parts
Well,
of the world?
I tour in Germany a great deal, and I speak to audiences there, and have appeared with Green Party people there, and so on stage. The Germans are a very strong green movement. After Fukushima, they shut down all of their nuclear power plants. And by the way, my story In the Zone about Chernobyl and the sort of animal paradise that's grown up in the absence of human beings there was published in Germany before it was published here, because the Germans got wind of it and they rushed it into print in the Deutsche Zeitung in German before it came out here, because the issue was so huge in Germany during the Fukushima accident. Their country is much older than ours, the Europeans. Their creatures are fairly well gone. You might see some brown bears in Romania, but I don't think there's a whole lot else. The papers were going crazy in Germany over the one brown bear that came into the country and was, of course, shot and killed. We, though, we're a pioneer society. We're a young society. We moved west. We saw nature for what it was in our minds, that is, to provide us with food and shelter without any thought to replenishment or balance or harmony. We're still a pioneer race. And again, I mean, I keep coming back to this, but Drop City, for instance, my novel set back in the late 60s when there was a Back to the Earth movement. I was just trying to assess that. It takes us to the last frontier of America in Alaska, and I talk about a trapper there, Seth Harding, and it turns out that we can't go back to the land because there are too many of us. We would need 25 square miles each in order to be able to live off the land in that way. But I still went back to kind of meditate on that. And again, that's the American pioneer spirit.
And I'm thinking about, of course, I had special focus in the Extinction Tales because I was rereading this and looking almost as a lens into some of your other work. I was thinking about that in relation to when the killing's done. And in Extinction Tales, I was thinking you're drawing some explicit links between human extinction and animal extinction. And then in When the Killing's Done, it seems like we're kind of the apex predator in that one. We're the dominant species. It's pretty well established. But now we've got this moral conflict because we can decide which aspects of nature are worth preserving and which we can throw away. And you've got these combatants, Alma Boyd Takesue, the National Park Service, and Dave LaJoy. Oh, Takesue.
Yeah.
And Dave LaJoy, the extreme environmental activist, and they're polar opposites, but they're both arguing about the future of the Channel Islands. And this seemed to push your environmentally themed fiction to such great areas. And it just makes me wonder how your perspective as an artist might have changed or shifted or complicated since those early days, since Descent of Man and Extinction Tales, when the issues of right and wrong were a bit more clearly defined.
Yeah, well, we want to exert control over nature. We build things. That's who we are. We make things. And in the case of these environmentalists, which, by the way, is based on a true story to a degree, they want to exert control over nature and to select which species belong. The conundrum comes to a head towards the end when Dave, in just an act of revenge and arrogance, brings a raccoon to the island and lets it go. And Alma sees that raccoon, but is of two minds. One, if it has been dropped off there by somebody, it doesn't belong, and it might negatively impact the environment, so it must be removed. However, if it got there on its own, let's say by rafting, as we presume the island fox and other species got there, well, then it belongs. It's a pioneer. Who has the right to make that decision, and can the decision go radically wrong? So yes, I think you're right, Dan. I mean, over the years, I've kind of deepened my view of the subject. It's inevitable. It's a conundrum. It's irresolvable. But I like to make art in order to address it and try to think things out on my own.
Now, we've been talking about some weighty, important topics: extirpation of species, degrading the biosphere. And there's another side of you I haven't addressed yet in this talk. Being a good entertainer for the reader, really amusing and diverting, and as with delivering the shocks, the warnings, the bad news, we've spoken a bit about the origins of the environmental activist in you. So I'm wondering where that entertainer side of you comes from. If you've always been kind of a natural performer or a ham, because some authors shy away from that stuff and they can be so sheepish about the performance of it. And you've always kind of gone the other way.
Well, everybody's different, and a lot of us become writers because we're introverts. I am not. I have that side of me, of course. You don't see me performing on stage when I'm writing a book. I'm holed up in the mountains writing, and I have a very private side. But I really enjoy being before the public. I get a tremendous rush from performing, and I like to remind people, especially young people, who might only see fiction as the dreaded homework assignment, that it's subversive, it's cool, it's fun, it can be great. And despite what the theorists might say and the people of the Academy, all art is entertainment at root. If it doesn't grab you and take you someplace, then it's poor art. It doesn't work. And I like to emphasize that. And of course, on stage, I'm not going to read difficult passages or give you my deepest thoughts. I'm going to find something in my work that will entertain you for that evening. For you showed up for that hour, I want to give you all I've got. So yes, I mean there is that side of me. I fronted a rock and roll band. I love to be on stage. I love to hear the audience. And for many years I would mainly read comedic stories because that's easy. You hear them laughing. But once I wrote the story Chicxulub, a very grueling, dramatic story, I began to read that and feel a whole other kind of rush. There's a point in that story, and I've read it to huge crowds, where nobody moves. It's, you go to the theater, you go to the opera, people are sneezing, they shuffle, they drop something, they eat popcorn. Nothing. I can feel every single person absolutely horrified. And as an actor, that makes me feel pretty good because, this is what fiction does for us. It takes us to a place we never want to be in real life.
This is such a perfect tie-in to my next question because your latest book, San Miguel, takes you pretty far outside of the category of the funny, the social satire. And certainly you've had stories, many short stories in the realist vein, including, of course, the Extinction Tales and serious books, the Tortilla Curtain, Drop City, among many others. But as far as novels that dispense with both comedic and satirical, I'm just wondering what led you to that decision, and if that's just a little bit unnerving for you to take that on, a straight-up historical novel.
Yes, it is, Dan, and I thank you for mentioning that. I'm always trying to do something different, to push myself, to see what I can do, and this is probably the most difficult novel I had to write because, as you say, it's the first time I've done a long narrative in a straightforward, realistic mode. First novel, Water Music, about Mungo Park's explorations in Africa, which, of course, does have an environmental theme, and it has to do with expropriating lands and so on, and colonialism. But also, it takes the traditional historical novel and sets it right on its head and has fun with that. But I don't see at this stage why I shouldn't attempt to do every possible kind of narrative. I mean, why limit myself? So yes, it was very difficult for me, but this was the mode in which the story came to me. And I enjoyed doing it as a challenge, and we shall see what readers think of it. So far, so good. Many people prefer this sort of narratives. That in an artistic career in which you produce a great deal of work, you don't want to be repeating yourself. That's self-defeating. You have to challenge yourself and try to move on to new things. Even though you may still revolve the same themes, there's always got to be a new way of looking at things. It's a more conventional way, as in the telling of this particular novel, San Miguel.
And speaking of that decision to look at something a new way, you are returning to the Channel Islands in your latest book, but with quite a different focus. When the Killings then, of course, involved the Channel Islands, and the natural and human history to a large extent. But this is not a prequel or a sequel. And the environmental aspect, of course, it's there with the sheep farming, but it's more off to the side. So I was just wondering what the decision to go back to the landscape in which when the Killing Time is set, but in from such a different perspective this time around.
Yeah, well, as we were saying, it's a way of staying fresh and seeing things in a different light. And further, as you may know, with San Miguel, I was lucky to discover these narratives, these real narratives behind the Diary of Marantha Waters, which the Santa Cruz Island Foundation under Marla Daly published as one of their occasional papers. It's only a very fragmented diary of maybe 40 pages or so, and then the larger narrative of the Lesters by Elise Lester, about their time on the island and what it was like to live apart from everyone else in a state of nature and attempt to live off of the land in sort of your own world. That idea, that utopian ideal, of course, I've written about many, many times, and it continues to fascinate me.
So really quickly, just a little bit about the upcoming the collection of short stories, which sounds like it's going to have a few familiar tales and some we've never seen before. Wondering about your selection process and what it's like to be a curator of your own work in that case.
This is the second volume of the collected stories. T.C. Boyle Stories 1 came out in '98. This will come out in 2013. So it's all the stories written since that volume. So yes, the entire 3 volumes that you already know of A Wild Child, Tooth and Claw, and After the Plague will be included. But there's a 4th volume altogether of new stories called A Death in Kitchwank, after that story that was in the New Yorker 2 years ago. And this is 14 new stories as well, so that it's not simply a compilation, it's something new as well. If there's going to be a selected stories, that might happen sometime in the future, and perhaps my editor would choose the stories. But for now, I'm very happy to give the collected stories out to the world, and of course, then both volumes will be collected in paper as well, so people can get what's going to be, it looks like, about 1,500 pages of stories.
Wonderful. Looking forward to that. Now, we began this interview in a rather apocalyptic vein when we discussed the Extinction Tales and its origins, and I just wanted to know if you've grown perhaps a tad more optimistic about the survival of the biosphere and the human race in the years since you wrote the Extinction Tales, or if you've just developed new cause for alarm since then.
Well, I've learned a great deal more, of course, over the years. Especially depressing was the reading in various environmentalists when I was preparing for writing A Friend of the Earth in the late 90s. And I would say that it's difficult to find much hope for the future of our species, I should say. When I'm going around with books and there's a Q&A, people want good news, and the only good news I can give them is that in a mere 3.5 billion years, the Earth will be a flaming cinder once the sun expands into a yellow giant. That's the good news.
Well, I guess the good news is that's out of our control. It feels like nothing that we're doing that's precipitating
again, when you look through these stories and novels and issues we've been talking about, that's another element. When you create art, you are exerting control over the material and over some portion of the world and creating an alternate world in which you exist as the God. But in our world, without a God, where everything is utterly random, there isn't a whole lot of hope that anyone can really find. We live and we die, that's it. My hope and my joy is to make art out of it and to try to ruminate on what it means to be alive on this planet.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with us. And I'm hoping you could read perhaps your favorite section of Extinction Tales for us.
Yes, Dan, I'll be happy to. I'll read the first piece, which is a little anecdote about the death and extinction of the Stephen Island wren. Also, a true story, incidentally. This actually happened, as preposterous as it may be. And for me, it serves as a kind of parable of our intentions or our haphazard way of living upon the earth and what it may mean to us. And by the way, this has a cat in it. And just as I opened the book, a very old cat climbed up into my lap. Now, this is a cat who would never kill a bird. Okay, the Extinction Tales. He was in his early 50s, between jobs, his wife dead 10 years. When he saw the position advertised in the Wellington paper, It struck him as highly romantic, and he was immediately attracted to it. Lighthouse keeper, Stephen Island, references. Inquire T.H. Penn, Maritime Authority. He took it, sold his furniture, paid the last of the rent, filled 2 duffel bags with socks and sweaters and his birdwatcher's guide, and hired a cart. Just as he was leaving, a neighbor approached him with something in her arms, pointed ears, yellow eyes. "Take it," she said, "for company." He slipped the kitten into the breast of his peacoat, waved, and started off down the road. Stephen Island is an eruption of sparsely wooded rock 17 miles northwest of Wellington. It is uninhabited. At night, the constellations wheel over the quarter-mile radius like mythical beasts. The man was to be relieved for 2 weeks every 6 months. He planted a garden, read, fished, smoked by the sea. The cat grew to adolescence. One afternoon it came to him with a peculiar bird clenched in its teeth. The man took the bird away, puzzled over it, and finally sent it to the National Museum at Wellington for identification. 3 weeks later, a reply came. He had discovered a new species, the Stephen Island wren. In the interim, the cat had brought him 14 more specimens of the odd little buff and white bird. The man never saw one of the birds alive. After a while, the cat stopped bringing them.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
You're quite welcome, Dan, and thank you.